Good evening all and welcome. I'm sorry no video on Tuesday. I have a pretty bad cold and my voice was terrible. I hope it's okay for today. But for now, please join me as we dive into the world of cryptids. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was on a ferry for a school softball trip off Kodiak Island, Arkansas in 2014. I was 18 at the time. A whole bunch of us had snuck up the deck around 11 PM to watch the waves and smoke a cigarette, and we'd and generally be teenagers on a boat without supervision. It must have been 11 PM in May in Alaska, so the sun was thinking about setting, but was still quite bright outside. So we're doing our thing when we notice a pod of orcas swimming with the ferry's wake, which is very cool, but not unusual. If you're familiar with the dimension of an orca fin, you know they're about 4 to 6 feet in height and look like a big black spike coming out the water. They travel and hunt in pods, anywhere between 15 to 40. The beautiful demon murderers of the sea, top of the food chain. We saw a pod of orcas, counted them to be around 15 or so with some babies scattered in there too. Very fun to watch. Took them a good 30 minutes to go by. We tried to get pictures, but it was too dark with our phones at the time. Another 30 or 4 minutes go by, and we've all pretty much sobered up. And it's about to get dark, and we're cold and sleepy and about ready to go in. No more orcas have been seen in about a half hour. And then one of my JV girls spots another one. So we all turn around and look. But one dorsal fin is immediately followed by another, and another, and another, and then two more, and then two more after that, in 2 separate rows, and they're taller by a lot, and jagged, like some have whole chunks torn out of them. They're all 8 to 10 feet high, and they're all attached to one creature. And we can just barely see its back slicing through the water, covered in these rows of spikes. And it just keeps coming. This thing is like 20 to 30 feet away from the ferry, running parallel to it, and we are transfixed. There's like 9 or 10 of us, and no one is saying a word, because we've all turned to look at a whale, and we're now watching something that is horrifically terrifying, obviously not a whale. Someone tries to take a picture, but it's too dark, and at this point the only reason we can see this thing is the light cast from the ferry's portholes. Tale as old as time when it comes to things you really wish you had a picture of. But as we stand there completely scared, in awe, we see this thing keep surfacing for a good 6 or 7 minutes, which means whatever it was long, like 60 to 70 feet or longer, and covered in enormous spikes. Spikes that look like they've won thousands of battles with God knows what. It took what felt like an eternity for any of us to say anything after the last of it disappeared back into the strait. I mean, if you and 8 of your friends had seen the exact same thing, that all science had definitely pointed to not existing, and you had all seen the exact same thing at the exact same time, and it being very obviously trailing or hunting 15 or something other apex predators, what do you even say to break the silence? That's the thing that eats me about the whole thing. It was hunting. It was following them. It was literally hunting about 60 tons of toothy, angry, intelligent apex predator. Every once in a while, one of us will hit another one up and check in and be like, "Do you remember this? Was I hallucinating? Did we all see the same insane, worldview melting, terrifying thing that night?" And the reason I know we did is because none of us spoke about it after that. Not during the trip, not after, not to any of our friends, because how the hell do you tell someone about something like that? Now it's been almost 10 years between us, and I assume some of them have probably told people. I know I tell people, because I've seen a lot of stuff like that in Alaska. And also because there's a very rich history among native Alaskans of a something that lives and hunts in the waters around Kodiak, and it's important to tell its story, because someday It's gonna eat a little too much plastic, and no one will ever watch it hunt a pod of orcas from a boat again. In the fall of 2010, I was 16 years old, living with my dad in our home in the countryside of southeastern Ohio. Our property's backyard, which is a field, actually bordered the largest state park in the state of Ohio, something I think played into this occurrence. It was around 8 p.m. when the sun had just fully set, allowing for the bright full moon to bathe the ground in its soft glow. I was sat watching some terrible movie. I believe it was The Summer Catch or something. That's when I felt the oddest sensation and urge to approach our large glass front door, almost like I was beckoned or called. Upon reaching the door, I looked out at the bright moon to see a tall, milky white creature on all fours running. It was like that until it stopped, as if a predator had sensed its prey. Its skin was pulled tight against its emaciated, almost skeletal body, which was practically glowing in the moonlight. It smelled like the air had a hungry wolf smelling for a rabbit before its head snapped to the right towards the front door, where it locked its eyes with me. Its eyes, a milky white devoid of any retina or pupil, and I also realized its lips and nose were absent from its pale, bald head. It felt like we were staring at each other for an eternity. After the stare down, it snapped its head forwards and sprinted towards the field of our property. After it left my sight, I immediately backed up slowly, similar to the scene in Jaws where Chief Brody sees the shark up close for the first time. Upon reaching the living room, my dad asked me why the weird entrance. I immediately told him in a shaky voice what I had just seen, which unsurprisingly for the pretty lackluster father he was, immediately shot down and told me I was either making it up or it must have been a coyote. I argued with him what I saw was no creature I'd ever seen, and that coyotes aren't hairless, pale, white, or emaciated. He just rolled his eyes and said to calm down and that it was nothing, and to let it go. I later thought it over, and considered that as he'd grown up on this property too, perhaps he'd seen it and just didn't want to mention or remember it. That night, I slept with my hockey stick in my bed next to me. Or I tried, but sleep eluded me. And I spent the next day nodding off in class as I tried to shake the weird feeling that locking eyes with it brought me. I began to slowly relax and pushed it to the back of my mind, only reminded when the sun went down daily that I had to let my dachshund puppy out every night. But every so often I'd look out to the dark woods of the state park in our backyard and feel like it was staring at me, as if it was waiting for its chance to come closer than before and make me sorry I ever looked it in the eyes. After high school, I moved in with my mum to the city, and because of mine and my father's strained relationship, but I knew deep down it was also so that I would never see that thing again, and that worked. I never did. But one cold weekend in the winter of 2013, my best friend's mother began to date my dad, so I decided to go visit and spend the weekend at his house. My dad and his girlfriend were Christmas shopping, as it was just my best friend and I home alone with the dogs. We needed to let them out to pee, so we opened the sliding back door to let them out. But we were hit with a deafening silence outside, as if nature and the nearby highway was muted. I immediately felt the feeling of those eyes in the woods looking at me, and was brought back to that night, years earlier. I told my friend to immediately shut the door. The dog could just pee inside, which would get me a tongue lashing from my dad, but so be it to escape this thing getting closer or smelling me again. Now comes the part that as of the last few months bothered me and made me feel like that night in 2010 left me cursed. Over the years after then, I've been in 2 car accidents, nearly died of appendicitis, had the worst string of bad luck, went through a period of time where I almost killed myself from depression, along with straight-up horrible instances where I felt cursed. Even recently, I've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which is a painful and life-hindering nerve and muscle disease that has forced me to go on disability, along with my worsening anxiety issues I've developed. I came to the conclusion I was cursed
in the realization that what I saw could have been a wendigo this past spring, when I watched a show called In Search of Monsters, which had an episode on the wendigo, where it was described to not only have the traditional accounts of being tall with a deer's skull, but as a tall, pale humanoid with no nose or lips, paired with milky white eyes. This, of course, caused me to have a full-blown panic attack and actually shake as I realized that is what I had locked eyes with. Then the research on the wendigo I did led me to feel terrible for the poor souls that must have suffered the fate of being one, and also in fear-induced awe of their ferocity and power. I believe when I locked eyes with it over 11 years ago, it didn't do what's often reported in making me another one of it, but instead cursed me to all these misfortunes that I have suffered through my life since.
About a year ago, I moved my family and I to a home way out in the woods in Tennessee. The nights here can be extremely loud. Between the crickets, tree frogs, and cicadas, it can almost be deafening. One night not too long after we moved in, I had forgotten something in my car and headed outside to get it. The first thing that struck me as odd was that my dog would not accompany me outside. Now, my dog goes everywhere with me, as I am her whole world, but not this night. As I held the door open, she looked out and then looked at me as if, nope. So I walked out and shut the door behind me. The second thing that caught me off guard was there was complete silence. Still shrugged it off, I walked down to my front steps and went to the car. When I had gotten about 10 feet from my car, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt as though something was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing. After I reached my car for what I had forgotten to grab earlier, I had this feeling like something was moving towards me. I took a step back and checked around me. All of a sudden I heard one of my hedges next to me that linked the walkway to our front door rattle. At first I thought it was a rabbit that I had spooked, as I had just seen one earlier in the day right where this was. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of a large rock about the size of a cantaloupe landing a few feet away from me. It hit the walkway and bounced into a shrub. I drew my gun and called out, "Whoever you are, this is about to be shot." After a few seconds of nothing, I began to think that maybe this was some local teenagers messing with new people. I holstered my sidearm, turned and started walking back towards my front door. Almost as soon as I turned towards my house, I heard this deep panting sound. It sounded like a huge dog, but what made me note back to my front door was that it sounded like it was right behind me. I leapt up onto my porch, turned and drew my gun again, expecting something right there. But again, there was nothing. A few weeks later, I was on my porch at night, sitting on a bench with my wife. She got up and walked inside to get something, and as soon as she shut the door, I heard that panting sound again. I couldn't see anything, yet this sounded like it was right on top of me. The sound was coming from everywhere and it was very loud. Again, I couldn't see anything, so I noped it back inside my house. Now at this point I was questioning moving here, but after nothing else really happened, I let it go. A month or so later, it was a really rainy and stormy night. This was around 9 p.m. My wife and I enjoy listening to the rain and talking about how relaxing it is. Me growing up in Oregon, I loved the rain. And for the past 10 years we lived in Vegas, where it would dump the entire year worth of rain in a day, then be bone dry for the rest of the year. For my wife, who grew up in Nevada, rain was such a rare thing she loved going outside and watching it. So for us it was an enjoyable experience. Except that this night in particular things took a weird turn. As we were sitting there talking about the rain and relaxing, my wife stopped me and said, "Did you hear that?" "No. What did you hear?" She goes to say, "I swear it sounded like a small child calling for help out in the woods." "No, I didn't hear anything." After a few moments of listening intently, she goes, "There it is again." I tell her I didn't hear a thing. You sure you're just not hearing things, I say? She looked at me offended that I didn't hear anything and said, No, I am positive. How could you not hear that? It sounded like our son. I think he's out there and got lost. No, he's asleep on the couch. We both looked through the blinds that were open right behind us and we could see all of our children laying there. She said it was weird, that she could have sworn it sounded just like him. Anyway, she stands up and says, Wow, he's really crying out for help. I need to go look for him. Now at this point, if you knew my wife, you know she's absolutely creeped out by the woods and wouldn't be caught dead walking in them in the daylight, much less at night during a storm. I grabbed her hand and said, I've been listening intently, dear, and there's no one calling out for help. You need to stay here. At this point, I'm getting worried about her. She was acting completely out of character, not to mention at this point, she's 8 months pregnant with our baby daughter. What if there's someone's child out lost in the woods? Well, first off, I would be able to hear them too. And secondly, there are no other kids around here for miles. The odds of them being lost 100 feet from our home when it's lit up like a Christmas tree is nil. Before I could say anything else, she stands up and starts walking towards the stairs. I jumped up and grabbed her hand again. No, get in the house. I don't know what's going on, but we need to get inside. We both go in. I don't know what happened, but it freaked me out. A few months after this, as it was just getting dark outside, I heard the front door to our house open and I got up to investigate. We have autistic 6-year-old twins, and we have the door set up so that they can't open it without us there. So, to hear this sound, it could only be my wife. What was weird was the fact that she usually doesn't go outside without saying something to me. I walked out front and saw my wife walking down our private road towards the drive on the side of the house. I asked her what she's doing, and she says she was sitting on the back patio and kept hearing a baby crying out in the woods. I said, Seriously? And you decide to walk off into the woods to investigate? She looks out into the woods and says, See, there it is again. I couldn't hear anything. But what I notice is that it's completely silent out again. I told her that the chances of a baby being out in the woods outside our home are slim, and that she needs to get back inside. What if someone left a baby out there? She says. Well, if that were true, I would hear it. Now at this point I was really starting to worry about my wife's mental health, and asked her to see a psychiatrist, and she did. Now looking back, I feel really bad about this, knowing what I know. A key to this moment was that my wife had just given birth to a baby girl a month before. A few days after this, we were on our front porch. It was early evening and I had just mowed the lawn, and our 3-year-old son was riding around in his little car in front of the house. Now he knows that he's not allowed outside of a certain area that we mapped off. He loves playing outside, but with the road 50 feet from our front porch, we have to be very careful, as lots of boaters will fly through after drinking all day on their boats. As we're talking, we both keep an eye on him. A neighbor drives by and stops to say hi for a second. This interaction took around 8 seconds, as all that we said were how are things and good, and he told us he would stop by later as his wife got something for the kids, who happens to be one of their school teachers. Okay, great, and he drove off. I looked over to where our son was and he was gone. I called out his name, ran over to the side of the house, and could hear his car on our side drive. I scolded him for leaving the area, and he said something in his 3-year-old gibberish that pointed to the woods behind our house. I said he had 5 seconds to get back up to the front of the house or else, and he adamantly pointed back in the direction of the woods, and kept trying to tell me something. I looked off in the direction of the woods and just assumed he saw a deer or a squirrel, or something that warranted a closer investigation. I walked him back up to the front of the house and he cried the whole way there. He got really upset that I wouldn't let him go into the woods, but I wrote this off as him being curious, as most 3-year-old boys are. Now this instance isn't isolated, as our twins have done similar things, but not quite as extreme as this. There have been nights where we've had just laid them down for the night and had a loud bang on the side of the house, on the wall behind our bed. It was so loud that I jumped and looked out the window. Our floodlight had come on, but I couldn't see anything. Now the weird part about this is that our bedroom sits about 12 feet from the ground, as we have a full-size basement that's cinder block. I put on my slippers and grabbed one of my 12-gauge shotguns outside to investigate, but it was dead silent. The floodlight that's outside my house had clicked off at this point, so I walked over to the other end of the deck and shined my light around the yard. There was nothing. I walked around the house and shined the light intently. As I approached the backside of my house, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like someone was watching me. I shined the light up in the trees, but again nothing. I rounded the corner, and the first thing I noticed were that my 3 dogs that were in the area weren't making a peep. Now our dogs have no filter, and will bark at anyone and everyone. This includes me. So to see them all hiding with their tails between their legs, not making a peep, really had me worried. As I kept walking, all of a sudden, the crickets and frogs started making sounds again. It was as if someone had clicked a switch. I walked back into the house and told my wife that I hadn't seen anything. She shrugged and said okay, as long as the dogs were fine. Due to the circumstances that night, I decided to let the dogs sleep with us. This very same thing has happened on all 4 exterior walls of our house. It's random and annoying, but just like this very instance, every time there's nothing going on outside. There have always been times where we were sitting in the house and I was watching a movie, when my wife walks over to me and will ask, "Did you call me?" I say no, and she swears she heard me call her name in her ear. She says that it was definitely my voice, but she didn't understand because it sounded so close, when I was a good 20 feet away from her in my recliner. The important part to this was that she was sitting at the table, doing something, and the slider to the backyard was open behind her. Now our back patio seats are about 20 feet off the ground, and it's like a balcony, as it has no stair access outside. I think the previous owner built it for a barbecue. There have been several instances where she would say she heard someone whisper in her ear, but she couldn't make the sound out. Again, I kept thinking I was going crazy, but as you will see, I think of all of this tied into the final moments where things are revealed. The last thing I want to mention before I get into what happened is that I have a shooting range built behind my workshop on the opposite side of our property next to the main road. It's kind of on a downslope, but it works perfectly for what I need it for. The range itself is cut straight into the woods going down about 100 yards or so. So when you're at the downrange, you have woods surrounding you on all sides except back up to my shop. I have to say it has always felt creepy when I'm dealing with my targets or mowing, when you're down there alone. It feels like you're miles from anyone. One day at around 5 in the evening, I was sighting a new rifle scope. The sun was still up, but was going to start to fade soon, so I knew this was going to be the final test. Up until this point, nothing really happened, while I was making my multiple trips downrange, other than this feeling of uneasiness. As I got downrange, I kept getting this feeling that something or someone was watching me. I looked around but didn't see anything. As I was placing stickers on my previous shots, I heard something big off to the side of me. It sounded like a large branch had snapped from a tree. Now, if you've been in Tennessee woods, you'll know that a lot of branches fall off trees randomly out of nowhere. This is nothing new. Except this time it was very loud and sounded like fresh, strong wood. I turned and looked again but couldn't see anything. I started walking back up to my rifle, and I swear I heard someone right behind me. As I turned around, I saw nothing. As I started to walk again, I heard this deep growl. It was really deep and loud, and what's worse is that it was all around me. I turned around facing the range and started walking backwards. The thought of some rabid dog charging out the bushes had freaked me out, so running wasn't a good idea. I slowly walked backwards up the hill to my rifle, but nothing happened. I grabbed my rifle and sprayed the target with rapid fire, hoping to scare off whatever was stalking me. I left 10 rounds of the mag and grabbed my rifle bag and quickly walked back up to the house. I never told my wife about this as I didn't want to freak her out. Fast forward about a year later from when we moved in, and my niece is staying with us as a live-in nanny to earn money over the summer break from college. We were on our way back from the store about a mile from our house, and I just saw two eyes reflecting in the headlights coming from a wide tree on the side of the road just ahead. It had caught my attention because they were higher than a deer, but a different size and color. Just as I had said, "What is that?" and squinted, they vanished. I had made a comment that it was almost as if it had known I could see its eyes and moved. The color was a golden green, but they resembled the mannerisms of a large cat and felt ominous. It's hard to explain, but I shrugged it off as we were passing the tree and saw nothing. A few moments later, we arrived at the house. As we were getting the bags from the car, my 3-year-old son came bolting out of the house excited to see me. As I was waiting for my niece to help carry in her bag, I heard my dog growl. I looked in the direction she was looking at, and it was my neighbor's property from across the street. Now, what I saw has kept me up at night. Up until this point, I've always been skeptical, as I had never seen anything with my own 2 eyes, even with what has happened to me the year prior. I still had my doubts that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Now, my street is kind of a spread out neighborhood. Each house sits on several acres, and at the end of our road is Kentucky Lake. My neighbor's house sits adjacent to my house on about an acre of lot. Directly in front of my house is a wall of woods, and directly behind my house is several thousand acres of untouched forest. As I was looking across the street to my neighbor's property, I saw a large, dark figure between the trees at first. The movement caught me off guard, as it looked like something big moving quickly on all fours. Then when it came out into the clear, it stood up and walked like a man. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. It was tall, very tall, but what was strange was the distance it was covering and the fact that when it was in the front of the shed, I swear I could see through it. But what was strange was the distance it covered very quickly, and that when it was in front of his shed, I swear I could see through it. It was clearly walking quickly, but moving faster than any person could at a sprint. More importantly, there was no sound. It was like it was phasing in and out of reality as it moved. What the hell? I realized it was looking directly at us. It had moved at an angle away from us to minimize its time out in the open, and moving as quickly as it could while still being silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized whatever it was striding towards us. I told my niece to get in the house. I grabbed my son and booked it inside. I grabbed my AR-15 with a short scope and came back outside to see my niece still getting stuff out of her car. Knowing I told her firmly and clearly to get in the house, her disregard to my command annoyed me, but I still watched over her without saying a word. As she was walking slowly, she turned towards the woods across the street from my house and suddenly bolted. She ran in up the steps in a panicked state. I asked her what she saw, and her face was as pale as a ghost. She said she heard something big in the woods, walking loudly on the leaves, and when she turned towards it, she heard a deep guttural growl. I asked her why she didn't come with me when I told her, and she said that she thought I was talking to my son. I told her what I had seen, and she wanted to get a closer look to see if she could see something. I told her that it was not a good idea, but she went anyway. As she was walking down the walkway, I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching in the woods across the street. I told her to stop and come take the flashlight. At this point, she's about 6 feet away from my wife's SUV. As she turned and started walking back to me, I caught a glimpse of something grey and hairy bolt from behind the SUV, back across the street into the woods. My porch is raised, like our SUV is about 6.5 feet tall, and whatever this thing was cleared about 45 feet in what looked like a single jump. It moved like lightning. Whatever it was wanted my niece. It then jumped behind the car out of my line of sight and was waiting for her. She still doubted my warnings and grabbed the flashlight and walked back towards the car. As she entered my driveway, she stopped dead in her tracks and leaned forwards as if to see something. I asked her what she saw, and she turned and ran back up the porch with a terrified look on her face. She said it was a figure hiding inside the tree. and that she saw its eyes. I asked her what they looked like, and all that she could say was that it was a dull red, but as she got closer it looked dead. I asked what she meant by dead, and she said that the pupils were grey like the way eyes look when they go blind. She said it was really dark grey, and she swears she could see through it, almost like a dark cloud. She wanted to go outside again, but it was a bad idea. Looking from the stairs, it appeared to be a tall humanoid-shaped being, ominous as hell. The next morning we did a height comparison to the tree limb she saw it standing over, and it put its height around 9 feet tall, and its eyes were about 6 inches apart. At this point I don't know what this thing was. After doing some research, I think this might have been the Glimmerman / a crawler. I looked to see if there had been any other sightings in Benton County, but nothing. More importantly, I swear it would phase in and out, almost like a shadow person but bigger and more obvious. Another thing that my niece had said that night was that she felt compelled to go back outside to it. She said it felt like the thing was communicating with her somehow, and it wanted her to go back outside. The more I read about this thing online, the more everything that has been happening over these past years makes sense. Like my wife wanting to go outside, hearing my son cry for help, the baby, my son going out, the dogs being scared. It all makes sense. A lot of properties down our road are undeveloped, unowned land. And on one of the trees there's a large old sign that says "Screamer lives here," with an arrow pointing back into the woods. Now I have to admit, when I first saw the sign I laughed, thinking maybe the owner screamed at trespassers who entered the property, or teenagers put it up to mess with him. But when I did a satellite search of our neighborhood, that entire section of road has no houses or trails or anything. It's just pure forest. Now that you understand the story, I doubt this is the end. The next question is, what can we do? I don't want my wife or kids to vanish one day. And if there is more than one of these things out there, do we really want to make them missing 411 cases? I feel perplexed and scared. Does anyone have any advice? I lived in Alberta, Canada, in the countryside for most of my life. I'll never forget the creature I saw when I was 9. I was at my cousin's treehouse alone, waiting for them to return. I was looking out the window with no glass, just a cut in the wall, when I noticed a large mass about 30 feet in the forest. I first thought it was a bear, but then I noticed it had bright red eyes. It was almost like they glowed. It looked right at me, then stood up. It had a bear-like head, but its body wasn't bear-like, and it looked insanely tall. It made a deep guttural sound as it slowly lumbered and shuffled towards me. I hid under the window and closed my eyes. I remember hearing it walk under the treehouse and kept going. I never saw the creature again, and I've never stayed alone in the forest since. I used to live in the Hogsback by Morrison, Colorado. I was always awake until 5 a.m. Well, one night, I heard the weirdest moan of my life. Like, ugh, but as deep as the ocean. I'm an idiot, so I grabbed my BB gun and went out back. I saw what looked like a dude shambling around, but what looked like rotted cloth hanging off in strips. It shambled away slowly, heading towards my way out there's neighbor 8-foot fence. I checked it through the scope, and it looked like matted arse dreads hanging loose but completely covered. It out of nowhere took off like 100 feet, and I thought it tripped, then shambled into my neighbor's fence, and was scraping its hands there for 20 minutes. It was a little taller than the fence. Then it dropped its hands to the sides and stood there for another 5, and bolted up the hill towards C470. The next afternoon I woke up and went to the neighbor's fence, and it was covered in gore. Bunny entrails hanging off the top of the posts, blood everywhere, and a rabbit pelt on the dirt. It was bizarre. I never saw or heard anything else like it. I've seen and heard black bears around there, but nothing like what I saw that night. This is actually both me and my mum's experience with what we believe to be the Jersey Devil, but not at the same time. We had separate encounters. I'm still not sure what I saw, to be clear, but to be honest, I don't want to experience it again either way. My mum grew up in Morristown, New Jersey during the 60s. She's a pretty skeptical person when it comes to anything supernatural, and I would say that I am too. Not religious in the slightest, and I don't believe in ghosts, but after my own experience, I do accept there are some things you really can't explain. I think the year was 1964. She would have been around 10. She has 2 brothers, and they are both involved in the Boy Scouts, but as the only girl, she tended to feel left out when they'd go on campouts. She was definitely a tomboy, and didn't understand, as the little sister, why she couldn't also go camping with the boys. Luckily, my grandpa was pretty in tune to this, and started including my mum where he could. He was a mechanical engineer, and was a big proponent of practical hands-on knowledge. Just because she was a girl didn't mean she wasn't going to learn how to change a tire or build a fire. In fact, she was the one who got me involved in Boy Scouts and still volunteers with my old troop 13 years after I've aged out, but I digress. Anyway, my grandpa started taking my uncles and her camping, shortly after my uncles started Scouts. My uncles didn't really care that much, and Mum wasn't interested until she thought she was being excluded. Obviously, she'd get upset when my uncles would go on troop trips without her, but my grandpa did this to give her the exact same experience where he could. My grandparents tried to get her to join Girl Scouts, but I guess her issue was wanting to be with her brothers doing what they were doing, not having a separate activity to go do by herself with other girls. As I said, I think she was 10 at the time, and Grandpa had taken Mum and my uncles to some state park for some late-night summer overnight camping and canoeing. All I remember, it was some river. Bass River Forest sounds right, after Googling, but to be honest, I don't remember. They spent the day paddling around in my grandpa's canoe near the campsite, and then they did the typical hot dogs on skewers and s'mores dinner before turning in for the night. Sometime during the night, she woke up needing to pee. There were pit latrines on the edge of the campground, but with it being pitch black out, she laid awake for about 20 minutes, until she felt that she really needed to go. She finally got the courage to do so, unzipped the tent, and poked her way across the campsite to the latrine. She went to the bathroom, poked her way back across the campsite, and climbed back into the tent. As she turned around to zip the tent shut, she caught a glimpse of 2 red dots staring at her from the side of the latrine she'd just come from. She said at first she just sat there staring, wondering what it was. Like she thought it was brake lights from a car, but it was just woods behind the latrine, so she didn't understand what a car would be doing over there. That is until they blinked and started moving very smoothly towards her. She said she zipped the tent up and crawled inside her sleeping bag and didn't move the rest of the night. They were camping right on the edge of the woods, so deer or other animals moving around at night isn't unusual. But she said the whole rest of the night she felt like something was slowly moving around the campsite, breathing. Any little twig breaking or leaf crunching had her terrified, but she didn't want to seem like a scaredy little girl and not get invited on any more trips, so she just stayed quiet and didn't wake my grandpa. She did say something to him the next morning and joked, "Oh, the Jersey Devil?" As far as I know, that was the end of it. She insists it wasn't a deer because the eyes seemed to pull off a red light of their own accord and moved so smoothly towards her almost as if they were hovering. She didn't have a flashlight or anything, and other than the moon it was pretty dark, so she doesn't believe it was just the reflection of a deer's eyes or something. Next up is my story. My grandparents lived in New Jersey until the early 2000s. So as I was a kid, we'd go up there for Thanksgiving or Christmas to visit, usually a few times a year. once in the fall/winter and once in the summer. On this particular trip, it was just after the 4th of July in 99. I was 9. Our neighbours in Virginia had put on a neighbourhood firework display which I ended up hating because a hot ember came down on my chin and gave me a blister. But that ingrained that particular 4th of July to my memory. A few days later we were staying up in New Jersey visiting and spent the trip swimming in my grandparents' pool as I tried to keep from knocking my burn blister open. It was for a while after dinner one night, and we were just sitting on the porch watching some stray fireworks that the neighbours were setting off, and the night was winding down. My grandma had gone up to bed, and it was me, my dad, and my grandpa sitting on the porch while my mum and sister were inside watching a movie. I remember it was warm, and it was a breezy night. You could smell the fireworks. My grandpa finally decides it was time to head up after my grandma and dad walks in the house behind him. So he grabs another beer, and I was left on the porch on my own. The fireworks had died down a few minutes earlier, so I was about to follow my dad in when I heard a thump up on the top of the house. I looked up over my shoulder and saw 2 red dots on the eave of the roof. I just sat there for a second thinking they were embers from the fireworks. But then, they blinked. This happened nearly 10 years ago. I recently spoke with an old co-worker that I ran into again and spoke about the old day, and it was brought up. When I was about 22, I was working for a small security company of only 18 people at the time. We worked an area of tourism called Seven Falls in southwest Colorado Springs, in the Cheyenne Mountain Canyon area. I remember the shifts being grueling, due mostly to the fact that we were mostly in direct sunlight during the afternoon and evening. At an average shift, we were expected to walk a minimum of 7 miles between the base and the parking area to the top of the falls. We rarely were allowed the use of the guest elevator for the handicapped and elderly. The whole park was on a hilly incline, so walking to the top down was okay. Bottom up is what exhausted us. In the evening near the base of the falls, native UT and/or Cheyenne tribal dancers would perform, and we had to monitor crowds, which were slight breaks for about 15 to 20 minutes. These falls were frequented by area tribes for hundreds of years, and were still considered spiritual. So it was the native tribes that pushed for their performances, since Seven Falls is considered a state park. At the end of the night, we would sit in the main entrance into the falls at the bottom of the canyon, off Lower Gold Road, and monitor the toll booth until about 1 a.m., except during weekend holidays when we were out there till 3 a.m. On several occasions, when waiting for my end of my shift, I always had occurrences that made me feel like I was going to be attacked by either an animal or a person. Gutting, hissing, deep, mannish groans, and harassing growls would always be heard from behind the giant gate. Glowing eyes, either red or white in color, but larger than area wildlife, could be seen from behind brush and tree canopies. But what stuck with me was the shimmering humanoid shape. The shimmering was otherworldly. The way I always described it to my family and a few friends was the like of Predator. My first work firearm was an older Smith & Wesson semi-automatic, single-pack pistol that was my dad's when he worked for the Fountain Police Department. But this was the first time I felt I was defenseless while working. I watched this shimmering silhouette crawl on the asphalt over to the toll booth, to what then appeared as if to be standing straight and extend a long, waving arm. This looked like a being, phasing between the physical and incorporeal realms. As I shifted my weight to look closer, as I was awestruck, the glowing reddish eyes slowly came back in focus. Then in a snap, I hear what sounds like an animal climbing up the side of the toll booth gutter, as I watched the shimmer jump into a tree, no less than 20 feet away. From here, the shimmer jumped again. This time a broken branch fell from the tree. A loud clashing sound ran from the top center of the gate, as the shimmer looked back one last time, before going over the gate and disappearing into the Seven Falls Park. That brings us today to May of 2022. My old co-worker and I ran into each other while at Walmart. We decided to go to the Gunther Totti's diner next door. While having a burger and reminiscing about the good old days, he brings up if I ever saw the Predator in his active camouflage at Seven Falls, and my blood ran cold, and I dropped a shade to just about pale. He then proceeded to tell me about his experience on the shift that I had never heard. After leaving the diner and arriving home, I sat in the driveway for a moment contemplating what inhabits Lower Gold Camp Road. It was the beginning of December at night. I was washing my hands in the kitchen sink at Grandma's, and as I was washing them, I saw a green hat bobbing up and down in front of the window that was centered above the sink. I screamed to Grandma that there was an elf out there, and she refused to let me go out to chase it, and I'll never forget the sheer look of terror in her eyes. When my dad came to pick me up much later that night, I ran around the house and there were footprints all around the window in the snow. My family have never been one to go the extra mile to add a bit more magic to the holiday season, so I'm convinced it was none of them. Could it have been an elf? Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Thank you for sticking around. I know this hasn't been the most productive few weeks, and I'm very sorry about that. Losing my my files on my computer was definitely a kick in the teeth, and then getting this illness doesn't really help. I tried recording parts of the video, as you may have noticed, while I was still sicker, which is why it doesn't sound, well, that great. Today doesn't sound that great, to be fair, but I'm hoping that in the next few days it's recovered enough for me to make a far better video, basically. Thank you for making it to the end. You don't know how much it means to me. It means the world to me, and I'm so happy and grateful for each and every one of you who sticks around and listens and just watches the videos. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much, truly. But until then, stay awesome, and I will see you in the next one.